So we estimated that the Russians would hit back pretty hard with cyber tools against the United States. They never really did in a way that was impactful.
My guest today is Andy Boyd, former director of the Center for Cyber Intelligence at the CIA, and now the CEO of Red Lattice Paragon. Andy has spent decades at the intersection of policy, intelligence, and cyber operations, from the Arab Spring to the fight against ISIS to managing cyber threats from Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea.
Every nation state uses their cyber tools differently. The People's Republic of China uses them for traditional intelligence collection, but they define intelligence very differently than we would.
We talk about offensive and defensive cyber maturity, operational resilience inside our critical infrastructure, and how AI is reshaping the battlefield and the boardroom.
The defenders also have access to these tools, and those AI tools, which can take an enormous amount of workload off of your staff so that your humans can just focus on really the most difficult threats to unpack.
This is a conversation about deterrence, innovation, and what it really takes to secure the future. And now, here's Andy Boyd. Well, I want to jump right in, and I want to talk about the work you're doing. But could we start with just kind of a background on you, where you started, how you got to where you're at? I know that could probably condense your life into a couple minutes, but let's hear it.
So I was obsessed with the idea of going to one of the military academies in high school, and so I only, much to my mother's chagrin, I only applied to two colleges, Annapolis and Air Force Academy. I ended up going to the Air Force Academy, graduated from there in 1993, spent 5 years as an intelligence officer in the Air Force, then joined the State Department for a decade, which that entire decade I spent overseas in Saudi Arabia, Lebanon.
It's be like late 90s or the aughts?
No, I joined the department in 99, and then so really 2000 through 2010.
Okay.
So first year was in Saudi Arabia was pre 9/11, and then 1 year post 9/11, Lebanon, Tunisia, Iraq, and then 3 years in
I was going to say, that's a pretty hot decade to be
Yeah,
in that area of the
right,
world.
it was.
I'm sure you were busy.
And then capped with 3 years in Syria, right before it was 2008 to 2010, before the revolution, before the Arab Spring. So I came back from that. I decided I wanted to be more, kind of go back to my roots in the Air Force and join the intelligence community. So I joined CIA. And my first sort of entree to that was getting involved in North Africa, which I thought was a fairly calm place until December 2010, and then the Arab Spring blew up, and so I was deeply involved in that. I went back to the field at one point after that. I actually took a sabbatical, so to speak. I went to National War College for a year after the Arab Spring. I was a little worn out, and National War College seemed like a great idea to read for a living. But then went back to the field, back to the Arab world. I was an Arabic speaker. I could probably hang, in a basic conversation, but not quite as fluent as I used to be. But I came back from that Arab world assignment in the mid teens. And had my first foray into the cyber world. I was asked to come and be the deputy chief of cyber operations, which, just the sort of over the horizon and close access operations. I really didn't know I had been involved in some of those in the field before, but not here in Washington. And I didn't really understand the complexity of it, but the leadership really wanted me to bring some field experience into that job. I fell in love with it immediately. They sent me to Georgetown to get a certificate in cybersecurity at night. I still had to do my day job. So I did that for 2 years, then went back to the Arab world once again in a chief of station job in a country back in the Middle East. We're not supposed to talk about which countries, so I'll just say I was chief of station in a Middle Eastern country. After that experience, I came back and I was chief of operations for counterterrorism globally. Actually during the first Trump administration, 2018 to 2020, where we had global responsibilities, but I would argue the bulk of what I was focused on was the ISIS threat in Iraq and Syria, and frankly, that occupied the overwhelming majority of my time. Gina Haspel was the director at the time, and when my predecessor in the Center for Cyber Intelligence indicated he was probably going to retire, I threw my hat in the ring and did everything other than beg for the job because I wanted to go back to the cyber, so to speak. And I'm very grateful to Gina. She gave me the job as director for Center for Cyber Intelligence. I started that job in January 2020, and I held that job until August 2023, when I handed the reins over to my deputy, who's done a phenomenal job since. And then I officially retired from CIA in October 2023.
Came out into the private sector.
The private sector, although I eased into it, what I really didn't want coming directly out of a pretty substantial leadership job. And just before I move into that, let me just describe what the Center for Cyber Intel does. Yeah. I mean, it's essentially the mission manager for all things cyber in CIA. The operational components, which is really kind of where I grew up in the operational components, but also an analytic component, a very substantial analytic component that wrote products, at the presidential daily brief level for the Oval Office, all the way down to analytic documents, which were really just for internal use, profiles that we use for future operations. On strategic cyber threats, both nation state and non-nation state. On the non-nation state side, the ransomware ecosystem, which is of considerable interest to the private sector as well. But also within CCI, were all the technological components that do vulnerability research, the development of tools to do cyber operations, intelligence collection, and whatnot. So all of that, was under my command, and reporting. At the time I took that job, I got the job when Gina Haspel was director, but then Bill Burns was the director after her. And the Center for Cyber Intelligence was involved in almost everything that Bill Burns had as a priority when he was director.
So far, like everything you've hit where you've held a job, it's like you got there at a time when it like got really hot. Because I can imagine cyber intelligence 2020 to 2023, big technological shift starting with the mass adoption of AI. I have to imagine, 3 years doesn't feel like a long time in any sort of federal institution, but I imagine at that time, those 3 years, did a lot happen? A lot of change?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of change. I mean, our priorities, from an adversary or global competition, near peer competition, depending on which country it is, or China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. We still had, the part of the counterterrorism mission supporting from a cyber collection perspective. And then, of course, our own mission set, the cyber threat mission. And there was an enormous amount of change in that cyber threat mission. But as you recall, during that period, February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was a cyber component to that. I was supporting our colleagues who run that part of the world directly on their operations, and frankly, preparing the political leadership and the national security leadership with, the potential for a threat from Russia in cyberspace as a sort of deterrent from Russia, or a counterattack, so to speak, depending on where we went policy-wise. What was interesting, and I've said this publicly before, what was interesting is we estimated that the Russians would hit back pretty hard with cyber tools against the United States, and they never really did in a way that was impactful. And there was a lot of folks who speculated that, well, maybe we overestimated Russian cyber capabilities. My argument is we did not overestimate Russian cyber capabilities, that they just have their own internal red lines that they may not be crossing. They certainly crossed them with the Ukrainians. They crossed every red line that's ever been created. But with the United States, they just did not cross those lines with disruptive or destructive cyber attacks. They certainly used all their cyber tools for espionage, collecting intelligence against us, and we did our best. CIA, NSA, CISA, the other components of the U.S. government did our best to defend against that. But we thought we would have seen more. And I think that's an open question, the why. And there may be only one person in the world who knows why they didn't use more cyber tools, and that's Vladimir Putin. And he hasn't told me why. So
that is interesting, because I remember at the time frame. So I work with defense industry customers. That's the world we operate in. And during that time, we do a regular threat brief when we meet with clients, talk about what threats we're concerned with. And for a good chunk of time there, we were like, hey, obviously all this action's opening up in Ukraine. We're helping the Ukrainians. Obviously, we're all going to be Russian targets. We have customers who have weapon systems platformed in Ukraine.
Right.
The threat brief was like, we're expecting it. At some point, we're going to see it. We're going to see some sort of, attack in the cyber domain from Russia. We're going to see them apply that pressure. And you're right. It doesn't feel like anything really happened. Nothing substantial. I'm sure they're still doing what they always do, sort of testing the fences and making disruption in the ways that they want to. But we never saw anything substantive. And that is curious whether or not it's like our defense is held and we just don't hear about it, or if they just didn't apply the pressure.
Well, there's two ways to think. On the Ukrainian side, I mean, the Russians planned very poorly on their actual kinetic invasion. I mean, you remember the long line of
the mile-long
vehicles. Yeah. That doesn't look like really good logistical battlefield planning to me. So my assumption, and I think this is a pretty accurate one, is they didn't plan particularly well on cyber operations. I mean, there's a lot of lead time to doing target enumeration and understanding, what the vulnerabilities are and how you're going to go about executing the cyber operation. And there were very few, to use an American term, there were very few people read into that. And so they weren't able to plan. So as a result, the beginning part of the cyber part of that invasion was a nothing burger, A, because of the Russian planning, but B, the Ukrainians have learned a lot over the past decade on how to defend their networks, how to harden their networks, how to partner with American and other, Western cyber defense firms. So the defenders do get credit to a certain extent in Ukraine for that. And then thirdly, just from the evidence, if they're launching missiles, if the Russians are launching missiles at the Ukrainian electric grid and kind of running out of missiles, if there was a cyber vector to shut down the electric grid, they definitely would have used
that. Yeah.
And clearly there wasn't, because otherwise they would have kept their medium range ballistic missiles where they were. On the U.S. side, I mean, I think rightly the Russian government, assessed that there was a huge risk of retaliation from the United States if they went directly against our financial system, one of the other 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And so perhaps, again, I mean, this is just an assessment. I don't have any, facts behind it. Perhaps they assessed that the threat that they would incur was too great. So instead, they focused their cyber tools on traditional espionage, gaining information via the SVR, the GRU, the FSB against American targets using cyber means, but also using, and this is the problem we have as Americans. Sometimes we mirror image ourselves, like, why aren't the Russians doing what we would do?
Right.
Because they don't. We have laws. and a constitution. So they have used their tools to sow disinformation, as we've seen, previously, and to take minor issues in American society and turn them into enormous things. Now, that worked for a while, but I think the American public and certainly the national security sector is onto them. So I think they have to probably go back to the drawing board on that. Like, how much influence do they really have by, for instance, encouraging people to not go vote in various American elections, because it certainly didn't work in 2024. Nobody paid the slightest bit of attention to it.
It seems like they miscalculated on so many fronts, right? With how everything was going to go,
right?
Both from militarily, and then I think when you look at how militarily, logistically they failed, it's easy to look at the lack of impact in the cyber domain. And I think just across the board, it's like you said, very few people involved, total miscalculation across the board.
Right.
Backfire.
Yeah. But in that tenure, from January 2020 until, early fall 2023, I mean, some of the other things that we focused on really, speak to how every nation state uses their cyber tools differently. The People's Republic of China uses them for traditional intelligence collection, but they define intelligence very differently than we would. They've, been involved in an enormous amount of intellectual property theft, stealing, every from nose cone to the fins on F-35s and naval technology, and outside of the defense industrial base context, medical devices, you name it. That's their R&D program. Is stealing American intellectual property, stealing American research that's taken decades, and then attempting to leapfrog in their own industry. That's what they use their cyber tools for, and pre-positioning tools in preparation for potential conflict. And we saw that with Volt, the Volt Typhoon, and the Salt Typhoon. Although Salt Typhoon arguably was more traditional intelligence collection against our telecommunications sector. The North Koreans, they're very focused on funding their government via cyber means. Stealing.
That's a fundraising operation.
Yeah, stealing billions of dollars of cryptocurrency and on occasion fiat currency from banks that don't have particularly good security. Not American banks, South American banks, and some Southeast Asian banks. But really, that's what they're doing.
They've gone as far as to get real jobs, remote jobs.
Well, and that's
salaries,
the other, and that was a developing problem, arguably a decade ago, but like we weren't really paying attention until 5 or 6 years ago about that. But yes, using their IT workers, who I don't think are the same people who are doing real bespoke cyber operations that at a nation state level. They're lower level IT workers, but with great cover stories, so to speak, where they get hired by American companies remotely. Yep. And during COVID, post COVID, that's a very companies that don't have their own IT guy or a CIO, they hire people, and they frequently hire people in third countries. But North Koreans posing as Filipino IT workers or Indian IT workers, people who have really good skills, and they do the legit work and then steal the intellectual property of whatever that company is, or theoretically lay down tools for a later day to do something disruptive or destructive. The Iranians, it's interesting. They do a lot of intelligence collection with their cyber tools, but they also like to send diplomatic messages. And this is, before the 12-day war, because they're a little bit on their back heel. They're not interested in sending diplomatic messages anymore, I don't think. But for instance, the Mujahideen al-Haq, was originally Iraqi based, but Iranian opposition to the current Iranian government. They were based in Iraq, but after the invasion in 2003, they moved out of there, and they were hosted in Albania. And the Iranian government packed into those computer systems and basically brought the entire government computing system to a screeching halt. I would argue that that's not an intelligence operation. That's not really a disruptive, destructive cyber operation in the way that the Russians would conceive it. It's really using disruptive and not permanently destructive. I mean, they eventually rebuilt their systems in a form of coercive diplomacy.
Yeah. It's a message.
Because they started, Albanians started reevaluating their relationship with the MEK, the Mujahideen al-Haq. And then in a much more minor and barely noticed way, the Iranians hacked into some water transportation, wastewater systems in the U.S., I think Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Texas, several years ago. It might be actually 3 years ago by now. I'm forgetting the exact date. But the point being, the software and some of the hardware components used in those wastewater treatment plants were of Israeli origin. And so they were sending a diplomatic message, so to speak, against that Israeli company. The problem is it was a really annoying day for the guy who manages the IT systems or the OT systems at these wastewater treatment plants, but it barely registered at the Washington level or the policymaker level, except for people who want to evaluate Iranian capability. That was a very interesting thing, and it was an interesting thing for companies that track APT, advanced persistent threats, and whatnot. So
there's a lot of that APT activity. I want to come back to Volt Typhoon, right?
Yeah.
Because we were talking about Russia and how we sort of expected some major activity from Russia in the cyber domain following our sanctions in support of Ukraine, and that kind of didn't really happen. In the same way, Volt Typhoon seemed to be opening up a big, not necessarily like a floodgate, but really brought to light how deeply embedded they are, haven't heard much since, right? And so I don't think we've closed out that threat vector, right? Like we don't think we've done a ton to move the Chinese APT out of our critical infrastructure, but haven't heard
they're
much.
certainly out of the critical infrastructure that was identified during the Volt Typhoon. I mean, some transportation-related networks in Guam, stuff like that. Now, there's a difference between the threat you've identified, you've shined a spotlight on, and you're mitigating whatever that threat is. There's probably hundreds of other threats that haven't been identified. So, but there's certain signatures behind that I think the assessment was that Vol Typhoon was associated with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and that is informing a hunt for other threats, and not just on the U.S. government side, but on the private sector side, the infrastructure owners and whatnot. But there's also mitigating from a defensive perspective, and have we solved all those issues in all 16 critical infrastructure sectors? Probably not. I mean, we discovered Salt Typhoon after Volt Typhoon, but it had probably been going on for quite a long time, and very focused on the national telecommunications infrastructure. Have we fixed everything in the telecommunications infrastructure that would ensure that there isn't still a threat actor from, again, my assessment was it was probably the MSS, roughly the equivalent of CIA or NSA on the PRC side. Are there MSS actors still in aspects of our telecommunications infrastructure? Probably. Are we going to allow them to stay there in perpetuity? I don't think so, or we certainly wouldn't want that to happen. But those are just really, transportation infrastructure and telecommunications are just a very small part of that broader critical infrastructure spectrum. So I think there's a lot of threats that are still out there, which means there's a lot of work for U.S. government cyber agencies, be they on the defensive side like CISA, or on the offensive side like Cyber Command and whatnot, and then the commercial, cyber defenders and critical infrastructure stakeholders that need to be involved in that process. So.
And that feels like the space is only opening up further. Like maybe we're gaining ground, but it feels like more and more there's more ground that we have to gain because of the way technology is changing. We can open up the AI topic. We could spend all the time in the world on the AI topic. But what I see in AI is the opportunity to empower lesser sophisticated actors to become way more sophisticated. And the attack surface just feels like it's going to expand and expand. Already feels like we're kind of behind the 8-ball, and we need even more.
Yeah, that is true. Although, like when ChatGPT became a public discussion as to what that tool can do. I mean, there were criminal actors, ransomware actors who heretofore could not have idiomatically correct American English.
Right.
Emails sent to you would be this sort of gibberish, like you knew just instinctively that it was not the guy who you think is emailing you. That is solved to a certain extent for the adversary. But even more importantly, they can use, and not really 0 days, but N days, using tool, the beginning of a tool chain, getting it off the dark web, but also just turning to AI tools to build an exploit on a known vulnerability. People don't have like the sort of expertise that people in my company have are able to do that. But the flip side of that is the defenders also have access to these tools, and the defenders, but vulnerability research, looking for exploits, looking for APTs. The defenders have those tools as well. And, defenders, if you're running a SOC or you're the CISO of a company, having those AI tools, which can take an enormous amount of workload off of your staff so that your humans can just focus on really the most difficult threats to unpack. I mean, I think in the end, the defenders are going to be winning that battle. And I'm watching that, happen in real time. Companies that I'm involved with who are using those AI tools purely from a traditional cyber defense perspective, but also using them to identify deep fakes, either, audio deep fakes, video deep fakes, and turning that frankly into a commercial product to defend intellectual property and even, to defend against reputational damage. So
there's something like, it's almost like replete through history, right? It's kind of always been the defenders always have the advantage. Now the attackers sometimes get it through like numbers or novel technique, but not for long.
right.
But once everyone's on even playing field, you generally
Yeah.
want to be the guy uphill, right?
Yeah, I mean, arguably, I was on the offensive side when I was in the government. Intelligence collection is sort of an offensive act, and for a very long time, we ran the field. I mean, us and other actors, including adversaries. I think that started changing 5 or 6 years ago, where the defense was in the ascendant, and in Western intelligence agencies, the Five Eyes, American intelligence services, had to really rethink tradecraft and whatnot to continue to succeed. I think the defenders are still in the ascendant, despite fears of offensive actors. Before we started, we were talking about RSA. I'm always fascinated when I walk the floors at RSA, the conference out in San Francisco every year, and the number of innovative entrepreneurial companies that are represented there, with tools that you hadn't really thought about. Like, wow, I hadn't thought about like automating that function or whatnot. I'm very confident that the defenders in that context are going to defeat our adversaries or defend us against our adversaries. But there's still a big role for the U.S. government to have offensive tools. They just have to really think through tradecraft and whatnot. So
let's talk about your private sector work now that
Yeah.
you're out. Now that
Yeah.
Maybe you're recovering Fed, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
I have folks who have been there their whole career, and they make the transition.
I mean, I
hear that.
was when I finally retired, and I looked at my I'm a retired federal government employee, so my records at Office of Personnel Management, you get a printout of what you're and I've been a government employee since I was 18, because I went to the Air Force Academy, which you're a government employee there. And I'm like, wow, I've been in the government that long? That's a really long time. I don't feel that old. So when I came out after a fairly significant leadership role, or multiple significant leadership roles, I really didn't want to. I wanted to be my own boss. I wanted to kind of do my own thing. So I consulted for about 18 months. I had a number of clients where I consulted on cyber defensive issues, cyber offense issues, interaction with technological components of the U.S. government. I sat on a number of boards, and then I did a bunch of media stuff. About 18 months into that, I was like, all right, now I'm ready to go, have a real job. And so AE Industrial Partners, a private equity firm, which owned Red Lattice, where I was on the board, and I'd been on the board since late 2023. They asked me to become an operating partner to help them with their national security practice, both on the private equity buyout side, but also on the venture capital side. And about 6 months into that, in 2025, the founder and CEO of Red Lattice took a step back after 12 years of basically nonstop 24/7,
Grinding.
365 days a year work. And AE asked me to take over as CEO of Red Lattice. So that's a very different place than where I was in October 2023 when I retired. But I'm really enjoying it.
How's that transition been? Like,
How
different is it?
If I jumped into it directly from being in the government as the CEO of Red Lattice, I think I would have really been sucking wind. But having an 18-month gap where you're consulting and you have some ownership of stuff, but you're not directly managing the humans, and you don't have the profit and loss responsibilities and whatnot. So the transition where I got lucky. I was able to build my own business as a consultant and enjoy that. Still make a great revenue stream for myself. But I'm really enjoying the leadership role that I have at Red Lattice, and I'll get more into the company, because the company's expanded quite a bit since then. But I also really enjoy being an operating partner at a private equity firm. I mean, the way, at least, I think a lot of private equity firms structure themselves like this. They have finance guys, guys who do deals, people who support the deals and whatnot, and then they bring older guys. I'm an older guy.
Graybeards.
Yeah, the graybeards in. and it's actually the perfect term to use, operating partner. People have been operators before in the context of the private sector, but also in context of the intel community or the military. There's retired 4-star generals who are also operating partners with me, former secretaries of the army and folks like that, folks who've really run large enterprises, particularly in the national security infrastructure, and just being able to advise my colleagues in AE about companies that would be relevant to national security is kind of both, again, on the private equity side, but also the venture side, is really been a thrill, because I'd never done any of that sort of thing before. So
there's a cynical position you can take regarding private equity groups are really just like profit motivated companies in something like national security space. Now, I think most people who have actually been there would argue the innovation that comes out of it drives so much of it forward. And now you've kind of seen both sides.
right.
We hear about the need for public-private partnership, making both types of organizations work well together. Curious what could you comment on the importance or why we want a private equity influenced apparatus or industry that serves these government functions like intelligence gathering or intelligence work?
So, I mean, there's as many private equity firms as you can think of business sectors in the country. So, I mean, there's certain private equity firms like the big guys like, Blackstone, who focus a great deal on real estate. And there's others that focus a great deal on other businesses. And so no one private equity company is like the other. I mean, there's some similarities, but AE, started mainly in aviation investments, because the founders came from GE Aerospace and Boeing and whatnot, and really knew that sector. That grew to focusing on broader aerospace issues, companies that launch satellites or are involved in satellite components or ground station work. And so they bought a number of companies in that sector: Firefly, York Space Systems, companies, Redwire, and another space-related company. And then that continued to grow towards just general national security-related companies. And so AE has an office in Georgetown. Everybody who works in that sector is really focused on the national security realm. And so Red Lattice in 2023 was bought by AE to start building, being one of the components of that national security space. We subsequently, in late 24, bought Paragon, which is an Israeli cyber company, nested it under Red Lattice. So Red Lattice, Paragon are a single company now, and I'm the global CEO for that company. But again, just sort of piece by piece expanding out AE's reach within the national security community, and ultimately, what the goal of AE is to grow those businesses, obviously to be profitable. They're not in the business of buying these companies to not be profitable, but to provide companies that are meeting a need for the U.S. government, be it the intel community, be it Department of War, be it the law enforcement community, and to really be part of the conversation on how the private sector, both the companies themselves and the operators within the companies, but also the investors, can contribute to that mission.
Again, I'm gonna represent a cynical take, not necessarily my position, but a cynical take can be the motivations and incentives for private entities and the government. Sometimes their two outcomes that they're working toward can be different, like profit versus mission assurance or whatever they're trying to accomplish, right? Maintaining a strong ethical foundation through that seems pretty important, and we want private entities, because I don't think you can get rid of private entities developing and innovating and providing services to the government. I think actually it's a critical enabler, like must have. But how do we do this ethically? Like, how do you keep companies that are developing intelligence gathering or offensive cyber capability from abusing that when the incentive could be to do something unethical to make money? You know what I mean?
So in my opinion, I'm not speaking for AE in this case, but my perception of it as an operating partner on the private equity side is, just the way our country has been structured in a democratic, federalist, capitalist society, that a PE firm is not going to invest in the national security space, is not going to invest in a company that isn't considered ethical, considered relevant to, be it the Department of War, be it the intel community. So, because you're not going to be profitable otherwise. And so why invest in a company that behaves unethically and is not a contributor to the ultimate customer's mission? I mean, so that's what I perceive we focus on at AE, and that's ultimately, the government needs companies like that. They're not going to, I mean, as AE is not involved with SpaceX, but we'll use them as an example. I mean, SpaceX was a very successful entrepreneurial company that filled a desperate need for the Air Force and then ultimately the Space Force that certain legacy companies weren't fulfilling, or at least weren't fulfilling at a speed that was relevant to what DoD and ultimately renamed Department of War wanted. And NASA and everyone else involved in that. That is what we're trying to do, or what my perception is we're trying to do on the private equity side at AE. On the operator side, on Red Lattice Paragon, there was a period where, the labels are unfortunate because they don't really speak to what we do as a company, but there was an executive order from the previous administration relating to spyware. I think the executive order itself is good. It provides sort of left and right limits as what the previous administration has considered ethical. And frankly, even if that EO was overturned, we'd stay within those left and right limits. But that was driven, because there were certain companies, and the most famous of them all is NSO Group and their Pegasus tool, that, they were obviously trying to make money, but they were really sort of, pushing the envelope, to be generous.
That's very generous, I think.
as to what their ethical standards were, and as a result, it ultimately blew up in their face. And the most famous victim of that was Jamal Khashoggi and him getting murdered in Turkey and whatnot, with NSO tools being used. That is not the company we are at Red Lattice Paragon. We participate in a number of international fora, that are pushing these ethical standards with the full understanding. And that's why I think the executive order, the spyware name, is just not helpful, because it just has a pejorative, sense to it. We build bespoke tools for the intelligence community, military, and law enforcement to do a very legitimate mission, informing decision makers with the intelligence side, being involved in facilitating military operations, or on the law enforcement side, helping lock up criminals, that are doing extraordinarily bad things, and using cyber means or enabling cyber means for the government entities to do that. But we don't sell everybody. We have a very restrictive list of countries that we sell to, and within that list of countries, a very restrictive list of customers that we would sell to. And on the American side, we're very focused on the U.S. customer, obviously, but we do, on the Paragon side, we do sell these tools globally, and I think our major contributor to democratic governments and their ability to secure their borders, secure defeat terrorism in their countries and whatnot, but within ethical guidelines. And there's one forum in particular that your viewers and listeners may be familiar with, called the Pall Mall process.
Okay.
Run out of the UK, but a lot of European government entities and private sector entities are involved in that. They reached out to us and asked us if we were interested in contributing to that discussion, and we jumped at it. There are a lot of other companies in that space that were like, "Oh, we don't want to be part of an ethical discussion." We were enthusiastically embracing that, because that is the ethos of the company itself. And again, that's at the Red Lattice Paragon level, the operators, but it's an endorsement of, the private equity company, AE Industrial Partners, obviously endorses that position as well, because they want all of their companies, in particular in the national security sector, to be adhering to those ethical standards.
Well, I think some part of your challenge is that there's institutional trust from the public is generally pretty low, right? Like generally at the moment, there's just not a lot of trust in things like government institutions. And then there's a great skepticism for private entities that service that sort of mission. But I think I certainly feel this way. I imagine most folks who listen to our podcast or watch understand the need for a strong intelligence apparatus. You've had a career in the intelligence apparatus. Just could we talk on like why we want a very sophisticated, very capable, very innovative intelligence gathering and cyber intelligence gathering capability?
Yeah, I mean, I would always tie it to shows or movies that a majority of Americans are at least familiar with, and like there's a movie Zero Dark 30 which came out a few years ago about the Bin Laden operation, and there was a lot of things they took 10 storylines and kind of mushed them into one storyline, and so each one of the individual storylines was fairly accurate. They compressed the time and whatnot, but it was still writ large very accurate. The only reason that we were able to kill Osama bin Laden as the leader of Al-Qaeda was because of all the intelligence collected and analyzed that led to that one point in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Without that, I think Osama bin Laden would still be, walking the earth. In other, counterterrorism context, I mean, we used a whole variety of intelligence collection means, a large portion of which were cyber driven, to find all the leadership of ISIS and repeatedly decimate the leadership of ISIS so that they were no longer the threat that they were, a decade ago in Syria, Iraq, and the rest of the world. You cannot do that without bespoke intelligence collection, which cyber tools are a major component of that. Military operations. You cannot do effective military operations today, and most importantly, military operations where the lives of U.S. soldiers, sailors, Marine and airmen are protected, unless you have really critical intelligence. So if you're going after a specific target, where that target is, and what the threats around that target are. If we didn't have that kind of intelligence, we wouldn't have military operations. Most recently in Venezuela, where not a single U.S. Military person became a casualty. I mean, I think there was a couple of injuries, and I don't want to minimize that. But I mean, in general, it was the
potential was there for it to be
right. It could have been catastrophic without effective intelligence. So if your listeners who aren't familiar with the intel community can look at it in that context, those very public things that there's a whole bunch of people staying up really late hours doing what it takes to inform those sorts of operations, they can get their head around that. We have a lot of criminal elements in the United States, and it's hard to find out where they are. Sometimes it's hard to get the information to lead to prosecution. Sometimes cyber tools have to be used in that. Be they people engaged in stalking our children, or people engaged in theft of our financial institutions, or people engaged in the proliferation of deadly drugs around the country. I mean, you need intelligence tools to put those people behind bars. There's a lot of TV shows about that. So if for any of your listeners or viewers who watch, Law and Order, and that's I'm really aging myself on that one. But that sort of thing, you need intelligence tools to collect that sort of information. So I mean, I think we just have to sort of demystify it. And there's a lot of myths around cyber tools. Everybody's like, oh, well, you're spying on me and on the phone in my pocket. They're not, unless you're a criminal, unless you're a terrorist, unless you're acting on the behalf of an adversary to the United States, and you're a counterintelligence threat. No, the U.S. government doesn't care about what's going on your phone or who you talk to or whatnot.
But that is what we would say, right? The cynical view is like, you guys would say that. Yeah. But a lot of my friends and family are not in the space that I'm in, cybersecurity, national security. And when we talk about things, or you just kind of hear their chatter about things, there's this low institutional trust, and there is this perception of capability that you get from Hollywood, right? You watch The Bourne Identity and you see like, they're tracking people to the foot. They got cameras everywhere all the time. They can see everything. There's some amount of truth to some of that in terms of capability, but there's this perception like it's this insanely capable, essentially a cabal in total control. And I always tell everyone when we get to these conversations, at family dinner or whatever else, like once you've met people who are in the institutions, you start to realize they're people.
Right.
And they're normal people.
With significant constraints on what they're allowed to do legally.
Right. And they're frankly not as capable as you imagine. I'm in the cybersecurity space and I'm in the national defense industrial sector. I've had a lot of interactions with some of the big names in the defense industry, the big prime contractors we all think of. And I've had conversations with the teams there, and I've consistently been surprised, to the point I'm no longer surprised, at how, I don't want to say immature they are, but you just have this perception of this insane maturity. And I'm like talking to them about the problems they're solving. Oh, it's the same problems we're having in the small business sector. It's the same security challenges. It's the same human challenges of securing their cyber assets. They're not some insanely capable born identity sort of construct. And again, it's all being serviced by people. And I've met so many people now who are career CIA operatives on the ground, career military officers at the general level, just everyone I've met, normal human beings. Mm-hmm. For the most part, well-motivated, properly motivated, self-constraining for the most part. Doesn't mean that they all are. But once you meet these people and you hear their stories and hear what they're doing, the work they're doing, and the way they're motivated, my skepticism goes down quite a bit. Because again, they're just people. Yeah.
I still think the U.S. military probably has the best brand of any of those institutions, and still has the utmost respect from most American citizens.
Yes.
The Intel community, less so, just because it's just a harder to understand entity, and we don't tend to.
Well, and there have been some serious, challenges, right? There's been NSA, the Snowden leaks, and all that. Like that started to really drive the distrust.
Right.
And as we say, trust is gained in drops, lost in buckets. Well, a lot of buckets got kicked over at that time. It seems like the national intelligence apparatus is gaining trust again. And I don't know that there's ever going to be like a seminal moment where we've turned the page, but I think the skepticism is going down a little bit. I think the current administration might be changing things a bit there, because there's been so much change, and it's been somewhat unpredictable in terms of action. So maybe that's a little tenuous, but certainly seems like we're making progress there.
I mean, again, back to the Bin Laden operation. I mean, it does have spikes like that when the average American can see like, oh wow, that's what my tax dollars are doing from an intelligence perspective. That's fantastic. But there's also things like that preceded that, a failure to detect the 19 perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. And that was a low moment for the intelligence community. I just so happened to be at the beginning of my career. And so there was a massive investment in the intelligence community at that point. And I still think we're riding the last part of that wave. That was all counterterrorism dollars. Yeah. I think the American people are going to want to know with some degree of confidence that, we are, as an intelligence community, I say I retired from the intelligence community, but I'm still involved from a commercial perspective, that we are focused on the next threat. How you communicate that to the American public, I frankly don't have an answer to that, because that was never real. I mean, I did communication like this in very bespoke sectors, but like a public level, political level discourse on the threats to the United States, I do think we as a country need to do a better job of getting the buy-in from the American public on their national security. What is the threat from China? What is the threat from Russia? What is the threat from North Korea? We currently have 2 carrier battle groups and a whole lot of other surface vessels and Air Force aircraft in theater right near Iran. What is in the American people's interest on that? I don't think, it's a great deterrent capability, and hopefully that's where it ends and we have an agreement with the Iranians. But it may not end up that way. And I think communicating with the American people as to why we have those forces in the region is important. And I think, and this isn't a comment on either political party, I just think in general in 2026, we're not communicating that effectively. And then that includes cyber threats. And what is the responsibility of every American for their own security, and private sector companies who own all the infrastructure, be it the telecommunications infrastructure, the data center infrastructure, the transportation, the communication transportation infrastructure. What are those responsibilities? I think we could do a better job as a community, and the U.S. government could do a better job on communicating what those responsibilities are. Because if you want the American people to not be suspicious of what you're up to, be it on the commercial national security side or the U.S. government, I think the best solution to that is to communicate with them.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier.
Right.
You used the term demystify.
Right.
Right. I think a lot of good ground can be made by demystifying things. Things are far more terrifying when they're left to your imagination, right? I think of the movie Jaws. Like, Jaws is such an effective movie because you never see the shark until like the last, bit. And then it's a great, glorious end. But so much of the tension is because your imagination is filling all that space. The most effective horror movies take advantage of that. And right now, everyone's got kind of a horror movie in their head of, what are these guys doing with all this AI?
Right.
What are they doing with Palantir? Like, what is happening?
Right.
Without the demystification and that clear explanation on what is, everyone's just left to their own devices to figure out. And there is already this sort of like bend toward skepticism, toward cynicism about it.
Right.
And I think you're dead on.
And on AI tools, I mean, the companies that I'm involved with, Red Lattice, Paragon being part of it, but some of the other companies where I'm on the boards, I mean, there's very specific use cases that AI is being wrapped into, be it vulnerability research or understanding the internet as an intelligence platform, et cetera. But I do think what we're missing currently is a policy / legislator discussion on AI. There are certain people who want zero regulation, and then there's certain people who want, an enormous amount of regulation. Somewhere in the middle, or some amalgamation of that is really what I think the solution is. But we're really not even having the public debate on it. And I think we need to. I think, every major technological development, needs some regulation. We have regulation for weapons. We have regulation for export of technology. We are not in a space where we don't really have codified regulation on AI, and part of that because it's a fairly AI itself and LLMs are not new, but the current iteration of them post ChatGPT 4 are fairly new, and I think Congress needs to really move out on proposing legislation, and the administration has to, set a policy where both sides of that debate have as much of a voice as the other, because the answer is not zero regulation.
Right,
It just can't be. We regulate a lot of things. We regulate cars. We regulate airplanes. Could you imagine if the FAA didn't provide guidelines to the airplanes that are you're flying, that Americans are flying every day? That would be one scary ride.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, you're right. It can't be either end of the extreme, right? And I think we're smart enough where we can find a good balance, because we don't want to stymie the progress.
Right.
And we have legitimate adversaries who are not as grounded in ethics that we have to keep pace with. And it's one of those, like, kind of got to develop the same fire capability that they have to keep pace, to play defense, right? Our tools on defense need to be as lethal, if not more, than their tools on offense for us to hold our ground, right?
And just even the basic, infrastructure associated with it, like how much power do we actually need for the data centers? Is that the right model? I mean, if I think it's DeepSeek, the Chinese company, was able to do their models without that much power, is heading down this path where we have to build nuclear power plants to power just a single data center. Is that the path we want to go down? There is some backlash in local communities building these data centers where, and this is where the economics and the market come in. They're building a data center, which then results in the price of power to go up because the power company's got to build, whether it's nuclear, solar, coal-fired, whatever the case is. And then the average consumer, their electricity goes up because they're actually paying for the data center, and they're not going to get anything out of that data center. So they're community leaders, municipal leaders that all have to be part of this conversation. And it's not necessarily the regulation and the left and right limits of what's considered ethical in AI will probably be driven by the Congress and the federal government. But there's going to be a lot of local government, state and municipal governments that are going to have to get involved too. I know there's certain people in Washington who want the federal government to tell the states what they're going to do with AI. I just don't think that's practical. I mean, we are a fed system where states have an enormous amount of power and should be allowed to decide what is relevant for their communities. So.
Do you? I've said this a lot. It's not anything original. I've repeated what other people have said about this, that AI is prompting a fourth industrial revolution. Right. So we've been through 3 industrial revolutions to date. This one is so seismic that we're going to call it the fourth. Do you believe that?
I mean, maybe. I mean, the problem with
or at least has the potential to be.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with putting those labels on a movement that's currently in motion is you don't really know what it's going to be at the end of it.
Declaring these are historic times.
I mean, like World War I wasn't called World War I until World War II happened.
That's right. Yeah.
Because it was just the Great War.
Yeah.
Because
we didn't know there was going to be an episode.
There was going to be a second.
Yeah.
Just so do we call it the fourth industrial revolution? I don't know, but I am 99% certain it's going to be a big disruption in the way we work, in the way we consume information, in jobs that heretofore, white collar, highly educated humans were filling, that they may no longer be doing that. Is that going to be a painful process in the short term? Probably. But I think also, like every major technological innovation, it leads to the creation of other jobs and creations of better efficiencies, which no one can predict what that's going to look like. But people can assume that we're smart enough not to destroy our lifestyle, which, the people who say, the robots are coming for us and it's going to be an unmitigated disaster. I don't buy that.
Yeah.
But we still need to think it through. And there is going to be a period where, like, for instance, we're in the DC area. There's a lot of lawyers here. A lot of my friends who are...
Feels like all of them.
Yeah. It's a lot of my friends who are actually, because again, we've established, I'm older. But my friends who are, my age, but they're supervising or hiring junior attorneys coming straight out of law school. A lot of the jobs that those junior attorneys do, especially in big DC law firms, I think a lot of that's going to go away.
Yeah.
Like, and maybe for the good, because it sounds like miserable work.
Yeah.
As a brand new,
data
lawyer.
aggregation.
Yeah, right. It's just it's going to go away. And is that going to be great for the 25-year-old who's just graduated, or 26-year-old, or however old you are when you leave law school? Is that going to be great for that person, like right now? No. Is it going to be beneficial to the law firm or commercial entities in general over time? Yeah, it will be, because then you can hire people to do more work that only a human could do.
Yeah.
But there's going to be certain, service industry work and certain other blue collar work that is not in a factory that is never going to be replaced. I mean, what's fascinating to me is tasks that you think you could train an AI bot and then whatever robot it's attached to, whatever form factor that is, to do certain things. You just can't get them to do it. And so, I'm very hopeful that we're going to get our handle on AI, and there will be short-term disruption like there is in any major technological advancement, but in the long term, it's going to be very positive.
And I'm totally with you there, because it's going to cause pain, right? It is so potentially disruptive that some of the apparatus of our society is going to be challenged. Whole sectors of jobs, whole types of jobs could be subsumed by this new capability. That's going to cause challenges, because now you have entire workforces of people who have to be moved into a different type of workforce. Just things have to change. It's like the process of building muscle is getting under a heavy bar and tearing your muscle fibers over and over to make them stronger and stronger. Some muscle fibers are going to get torn through this process.
All right.
But we don't really have a choice. That's the other thing. So a couple of things you said made me think about the conversations I have in my real life with people about AI. And kind of the leading thing I hear about now from people who aren't in the IT space, in the national security space, is like about the data centers, the disruption to my local community of these data centers, the cost of energy, the climate impact of data centers, and the increase in demand for power, coal power plants coming back online that were offline to feed this insatiable need for power. A lot of people only see that, and then they see their interaction with AI as like, hey, it's my better way of Googling now. So for a lot of people I talk to, there's no connection between the benefit and the cost. They just see this insane cost to make Google, more effective. They don't see all this potential. They hear about it. We've been hearing about it for 3 years, like, hey, this is going to move cancer research forward. It's going to make society all better. But all they're hearing and seeing is people are going to start losing their jobs. It's going to be harder for the young up-and-coming lawyer to carve out a life. And you're going to devastate our local communities. So I get the skepticism and the cynicism there, but I share your optimistic output or outcome view long term. You made a great point though, which is to navigate through all this. Kind of feels like we need stronger leadership at that national, federal, congressional, presidential level. I don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this, be it whether it's the fourth industrial revolution or however we want to label it. I don't know if we look back at the other revolutions, how much engagement we had from a leadership perspective during those revolutions. I think they're all basically the same, like at the political level, at the corporate leadership level, at the educational institution level. Everybody's just trying to figure out what game it is that we're playing.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
I thought we were playing football, but it looks like we're playing we're curling. Like people I think are just trying to get their heads around it. So if we demand very specific political leadership and for certain people to seize the reins on this issue, we may not like the outcome. So because you need engagement, but you don't necessarily want one person in charge of all of it.
Yeah.
Because I think the strength of the United States is we have a diversity of opinions and a diversity of intellectual approaches to things. And I think in the aggregate, we'll figure it out. Now, do we have to codify some of that debate? Yeah. I mean, we need legislation. We need, be on from the executive branch, executive orders on certain things. But does that shut down the debate? No. I mean, we're still going to have the debate in state capitals and in municipalities. And someone who hasn't even raised their hand yet may, say, hey, by the way, have you thought about X? Have you thought about how this is going to affect the water supply in a desert state? Because data centers need a lot of water for cooling. There's a whole variety of things that are going to come out, and no one person, frankly, can dictate, how that's going to, because otherwise we'd be in Beijing, and that doesn't work out particularly well for Xi Jinping and his government. I mean, a state-controlled economy is just not what I think you and I or your listeners and viewers want to live in. No. But I think in the aggregate we'll get there. There's some counterintuitive thoughts that a lot of people are having, myself included. Like, what do you do? My oldest is looking at colleges, and she's thinking about like what should she be focused on in preparation for college, and should we become electrical engineers? Coding maybe not so much.
Right. Should we even become computer scientists anymore?
And my argument, and I think frankly the younger generation's already figured this out, is they have to be multidisciplinary. You have to understand enough technology so that you can use it. You have to understand how to use AI, but you also have to have a very good grasp on the humanities to be successful, and to have an understanding of how to communicate in written form, in spoken form, and how to have decent EQ in addition to your IQ, because that's going to be the differentiator, is people who can use technology but have the judgment to understand what's important, what's not important, and how to use that, either in an educational setting or a corporate setting or a government setting or any other sort of political leadership setting. And so, a number of my friends who are, English majors and whatnot are, I think inaccurately predicting doom and gloom. I still think the world needs English majors, history majors, political science majors, art majors, because at the end of the day, there's no technology there's a technology that can write those things. There's technologies that can paint pictures, but there's not going to be anyone who understands only humans can understand what they mean and how they relate to culture and how they relate to our lives and whatnot.
Told you we were going to get a little philosophical.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
and it's a philosophical problem we're kind of looking at.
Right.
It can redefine humanity at some level.
And just as a more, a concrete example, I mean, the analysts that I had working for me in the Center for Cyber Intelligence, the best analysts, and they tended to be the younger ones, who were both equally engineer or comp sci and English majors, poli-sci majors, history majors, people who could understand the technology, maybe not at the coding level, but enough where they understood how the technology works, but they could also then write about it and communicate verbally about it.
You mentioned the defenders are kind of on the ascendancy, right?
Right.
I imagine some part of that is because in the last decade, I've really seen a lot of non-traditional entrance into the cyber space. Like a lot of, so at my company, a lot of our best performers are people who are coming from entirely different fields. Like we have folks who come from education.
Right.
And they come in and they just have a different perspective that you don't know at the time you're going to benefit greatly from, but boy, do you. And I wonder if like we're kind of seeing that part of the ascendancy has been a great injection of people with that sort of diverse background. Like you guys might've been ahead of the curve, recognizing that, and maybe the private sector is sort of starting to understand like, hey, this diversity of thought, of opinion, of experience coming in is a big benefit.
Yeah. I mean, and I think the younger generations figured that out before that discussion even started. A close friend of mine from my military days, his son's a senior at Berkeley. He's a double E major, double major actually, and double E in comp sci, but he takes a lot of political science classes. And I was asking him, I was like, so what's the deal? Is that just to inflate your GPA? And he's like, no, I just really like it. And I'm looking at his course load, and he's got like a whole bunch of these things. And he didn't think it was particularly unusual. Like, it's like everybody does that now. I'm like, well, 30 years ago when I went to school, you were a double E major or you're a political science major. There was a handful of people who could pull off a double major, but not a whole lot. And I think the current generation actually seems to have been able to pull that off more because they understand the importance of if you're going to have a global understanding of things, yes, you have to understand technology. And if you're going to be in a company where you're an entrepreneur and you need to understand engineering at a deep level, you need a degree like that. But you also need to understand how it fits in the broader context of the world. And I think people are going to organically gravitate, or at least the current generation is going to organically gravitate towards a more multidisciplinary approach. But the one thing that won't work is if adults impose it on them.
Yeah,
they got to find it. Yeah. If we impose it on them, they're going to be like, okay, the boomers, I'm not a boomer, but just for argument's sake, the kids really like that word. They're imposing on me. It must be wrong. I got to figure it out on my own. So.
That's like humanity has not learned that lesson through time. Right. Parents just have never learned that whatever you impose, you are likely to get the opposite outcome.
Right.
I think anyone who has kids, you learn that lesson, and your instincts don't change to try to impose things on them. But you're totally right. Hopeful. I see optimism in that they're adapting and understanding their future's going to be multidisciplinary, and that gives me a lot of optimism. For their enjoyment of life, because frankly, being specialized and not being multidisciplinary doesn't seem very attractive to me.
Right.
I'm a multidisciplinary person by nature, so I think maybe the future just looks kind of bright for me, just from like personal enjoyment. Right. I'm a cybersecurity guy. I'm a paramedic. I've got lots of different hobbies, and I love that I get to apply myself to all of those.
And that's when I say multidisciplinary, I mean within the university setting, but also outside, as you're alluding to, and I think the younger generation understands that. Learning doesn't stop when you graduate from college. What I would encourage young people though is to not forego college to do multidisciplinary stuff that doesn't include it. Because if you have the means and the academic background to do it, it is still a credential that means something. The idea that you can advance in life, I mean, statistically, you have $1 million, at least in 2026, $1 million more lifetime earning power with a college degree. It sucks that that's the rules of the game, but that is the rule of the game.
Right.
Because, kids of friends of mine are like, yeah, I'm going to just drop out and go invent my own company. Okay, do that, but can you just wait 2 years?
Yeah, just finish.
Or at least finish your degree at night, or something along those lines. Because to be a true multidisciplinary, I think you need to do both in the university setting and outside. And the paramedic thing sounds really exciting. So
yeah, it's a complementary skill set, which was not by design, right?
Yeah.
I pursued passions because I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up,
Right.
and I mostly still don't. But I've got some semblance of what I like, and for my career, I kind of pursued both for a while, and then once I figured out I also wanted to be a dad and a breadwinner and have a family, it was pretty clear to me which line I should go down. So that's when I committed to my IT career. But to get philosophical again and bring it back to AI and sort of the potential it poses, it's almost like it could allow us to be more focused on being human. Like I think of that young law school grad who would spend the first couple of years of their career essentially functioning as a search engine for the senior partners, going out and doing all that menial labor, right? There's some future where that we're liberated from.
Right.
And maybe you can have the freedom to be more focused on being human. Humans are multidisciplinary. That is the strength.
Right.
And so having more of that seems like, a net win in a philosophical sense.
Right.
Is that a fully formed thought? Not really, but
Yeah, who knows? That kid coming out of law school who's, been replaced by AI, maybe it's the next Picasso and we'll have a great artist out of that. So.
Right. And that's one of the things that sucks about AI is kind of how like it's immediately one of the immediate applications has been to art.
Right.
You're like, that's the one thing it shouldn't do.
Right.
Like, let's not let it do all the art. Like that's unique.
But the AI doesn't know why it's doing
exactly.
it. And the artist, whoever that law student is, who's going to be the next Picasso, they know exactly why they're doing it, and they know the interpretation behind what they're producing, whatever the art is, if it's visual or film or whatnot. The AI has no idea why. It was prompted.
And it can't.
It was prompted to paint a picture that looked like a Monet, but was of Times Square in New York, and doesn't really know why it was doing it. It's just prompted to do it. So.
This is a national security podcast.
Yeah, that's not an art podcast. Yeah, Sorry, we headed down that philosophical route. So.
But it's fascinating. It's interesting, to watch. There's, we talk a lot about optimism on the podcast, and we'll come back to that as when we get toward the end, because I always like to ground things in optimism. But I totally see an optimistic future. I also see the Skynet fear. Like I get it. I get the fear and the skepticism around the development of this crazy new technology that's largely homed with a few insanely powerful people. That is risky. And we need to do something about that. We need some regulation. It can't be none, but we shouldn't be afraid of it at the same time, right? We can see what net benefit could come from it. It looks like an incredibly powerful technology, a game-changing technology. We need to invest in it. We need to be purposeful and smart and not afraid of it. We need to demystify it.
Right. Yeah. And it's never as bad as the doom and gloomers think it is. And it's never as great as the optimists think.
Right.
It's always somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. So. We're going to totally change topic because I want to come back to something.
Okay.
You mentioned being in the Middle East during the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And I remember that time, total outsider to, politics at the time, or certainly geopolitics. It was seen as a revolutionary moment. Like, is this the time where the Middle East is going to totally change? Kind of feels like it hasn't. Like, what is the legacy of the Arab Spring?
I mean, I think it's a generational change, and that the Arab Spring kicked off in Tunisia in December 2010, and again, it's only been 15 years hence, and so I don't think we have the generational historical conclusion on that. That'll be a 30-40 year cycle, because I think there's been a number of counter revolutions. I mean, Tunisia, for a very long part of that 15-year period, was the democratic example of the post-Arab Spring government, where they had democratic, free and fair elections. They have backtracked. They no longer have the Ennahda, which is the Islamist party there, has been basically cast out and considered illegal. In a much more quick sort of counter-revolutionary cycle. I mean, the Mubarak government in Egypt was overthrown, but then the Muslim Brotherhood came in. They made a mess of it. So arguably they needed to go, but probably not in such a violent sort of way. The Sisi government took over in a counter-revolutionary sense. So you can't necessarily point to a single country that went through that Arab Spring revolutionary process as a shining example of democratic freedoms in the Arab world. Now, would have anyone predicted that Ahmed al-Shara, the current president of Syria, former member of al-Qaeda, detainee at Buqa prison in Iraq of the U.S. military, would overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad? I don't think anybody would have predicted that in 2010. Even Ahmed al-Shara himself.
Right.
He would not have, like, wow, me? And then he did, occupied the presidential palace in Damascus, put on a suit and tie, and met with President Trump. So arguably the most successful, and it was not directly tied to the 2010 Arab Spring, but sort of eventually headed that way. Arguably the most successful Arab Spring related revolution was won by a guy who used to be in Al-Qaeda. Now, what does that all mean?
Yeah.
I don't think we know quite yet.
Yeah.
Because, and I lived in Syria for 3 years. It is a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional country: Kurds, Muslims, Christians, Shia, Sunni, Alawi. How he's going to wrangle that is as good. Your guess is as good as anyone else's. But that is, when we look at the arc of history over 30 or 40 years, that is part of the Arab Spring. And what will ultimately come out of that, I don't know. I also think the Abraham Accords, which President Trump initiated in his first term, which that brings a sort of peace treaty, so to speak, between certain Arab countries and Israel, is also part of that cycle where the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis are in communication, and the Qataris are in communication with the Israelis, trying to kind of walk away from the past 60 years of animus between those groups and really head into a future of economic development and trade between all those countries. Again, not directly tied to the Arab Spring, but I think that's part of that process. So 20 years from now, 30 years from now, are we going to have a more democratic Arab world? Maybe part of it, but I think we'll have a more economically prosperous Arab world that drops a lot of the sort of political rhetoric that had characterized the generation before, and realized, well, all boats can rise if we actually have economic relationships. So.
Yeah, you said, no one's sort of come out of that as the shiny example, right? But
right.
I was racking my brain on that, like who has? Like, not even us, right? You look at our revolution, we come out suddenly perfectly democratic, like immediately went into like political turmoil and alien sedition acts and all sorts of like crazy stuff within a couple of years. It's a process. And I guess my question's kind of a bad question of like, what's the legacy of something that happened, essentially a decade or so ago? We don't know yet. That's a good answer for it.
Yeah.
But definitely there are some seeds planted.
There are definitely
don't know what they're going to bear
seeds
yet.
planted, but I think there's probably in certain countries, there's going to be a counter revolution. I don't think the people of Tunisia are going to put up with the restoration of a dictatorship there. I don't think the Egyptians, are economically dependent to a certain extent on tourism. I mean, I think, whatever system of government they want in Egypt is going to have to encourage more tourism. I don't think, they're back to where they were 30 years ago in tourism. So I think there's going to be incremental steps, then 2 steps back, 1 step forward. But I think when historians look at this epoch, decades from now, they will see that their incremental change started in 2010 with the Arab Spring.
So we've covered a lot of ground, major societal change, major technological change, major national security threats. And you're, as a CEO of a company in that space, you're kind of faced with navigating all of those waters because everything impacts, you have people that work for you. Well, everything that impacts people impacts you. Everything that impacts the lane that you're in, and national security and intelligence impacts you. As you look at your role as a CEO, as a leader through that, what's going to make you, or what makes a good leader for navigating that sort of water?
So, I had to build off the example of what I learned when I was in the government. My goals as a CEO are and when it comes to my managing my human resources, are very similar to how I managed the government. Understanding what the mission is, distilling down a mission statement for the company that's meaningful to the employees, making clear what their contributions are to that role. And again, on the American side of the company and on the Israeli side of the company. And everybody needs, a salary. Everybody wants to be well compensated for their work, but that's not going to get you what you need. Otherwise, people like me wouldn't have spent, 35 years in the government, because it's not the best salary you can find. But that's not going to get you completely down the field in the private sector either. People want to know they have meaningful work. People want to know that they're appreciated. People want to know that what they're working on, at least in the context of a cyber security related company, that what they're doing is unique and applicable to whatever the mission set is that the company set out. So I mean, that's what I try to do. I don't try to get into the gubbins, so to speak, of the actual technology. I have people who do that, and frankly are smarter than me on that sort of thing. I just want to make sure that all those people are rowing in the same direction and trying to build products that are relevant in this context to the national security needs of the U.S. government or customers overseas. Do I want to be an inspirational leader? I mean, yes. I mean, that would be great, but that's in the eye of the beholder. I don't know if my employees find that inspirational. They all tend to ask me lots of questions. Okay, how would have you done this in the government? How would have this worked in previous elements of your career? And I try to apply that to my role as a CEO. What I also do is and this was relevant to where I was in the Center for Cyber Intelligence. A lot of the folks that were in that unit didn't necessarily have access to policymakers or people on the Hill. At the senior level, they did. But translating, and again, this is when I was in the government, translating policy goals, legislative imperatives into what was going on in my unit in the agency, people just felt better about it and better understood what their role in that process was. I try to apply that in the private sector context as well, where I explain, meetings that I have. I still have meetings at the National Security Council. I still have meetings in the context of this job at the Office of National Cyber Director at the White House, on the Hill, and with other policy people, and at the Pentagon, et cetera. And explaining, okay, this is what this customer needs at a very strategic level, and how that's going to translate down to what we're doing in Red Lattice Paragon, and how we can change, if we need to change, how we're producing those products and making those products more applicable to the customer. I have found that taking grand strategy, strategic level ideas and translating them into tactical or operational applications has been very productive from a leadership perspective on my government side of my career and on the private sector side.
So you spent a career still, like you're not in the gov anymore, but you're still essentially gov adjacent, right?
Yes,
you're still serving
absolutely.
that mission.
Yeah.
And you opened up by talking about this all starts with, high school Andy applying to only military academies, and that was your only interest in terms of going to college.
Which I'm not saying that's the right thing.
No, but I want to know, where did that come from? Why?
Yeah.
What sent you on this path? Why were you so convicted from the beginning that this was kind of where you wanted to go?
So in jest, I blame Tom Cruise because the original Top Gun came out in 1987.
That's why you did Naval Academy, Air Force Academy.
I was applying to college. But that's really sort of a joke. My dad was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. And so and frankly, he'd gotten out before I was even born, but I heard a lot about it, and friends of his, my uncle, great uncle, was B-17 pilot in World War II, was actually shot down for historians who are listening or watching your podcast, on the Schweinfurt raid in 1944, a ball bearing plant in Germany. He was shot down over that, survived, was a POW in Stalag Luft 3, I think, in Munich. And so I listened to his stories, and one of my more memorable books that I read as a fifth grader, believe it or not, Cornelius Ryan, The Longest Day, about the D-Day.
Fifth grader,
So,
wow.
Yeah, I was a weird kid. And so I'd been interested in...
weird kids become interesting adults.
Yeah, right. And so I'd been interested in military history for quite some time. So it was a very natural progression for me. I should have followed my mom's advice and had a couple of backups, because that's just the smart thing to do. because I'm advising my own daughter that like we got to apply to a lot of schools. So yeah, I am not the shining example for, parental satisfaction when it comes to university applications. So,
What worked out in your case?
it did work out, yeah. But I look back at that 17-year-old kid and say, man, you're an arrogant little bastard, aren't you? Yeah.
You always wonder if you could go back and talk to yourself, what would you say?
Yeah, I'd say like you have more confidence than you're really
right.
You really are entitled to.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
Yeah.
Well, I already kind of give you a preview of how we end the podcast, right? Yeah. We have a tradition because so often the topics we talk about can be pessimistic. We talk about institutional skepticism and emerging tech and national security threats and all that sort of stuff. But generally, I find the people that are applying themselves to these problems are optimistic by nature.
Yeah.
I certainly am.
Yeah.
And I always like to end on a very human and philosophical note, potentially, to understand and ask, where does your optimism come from? Like, where do you ground yourself in optimism? Where do you source it?
I mean, I have 2 teenage daughters, and I think I ground a lot of my optimism and my happiness and frankly my positive, optimistic outlook on them. I mean, there are always challenges at times, but a lot of joy. I mean, it's quite interesting that my career has been focused on counterterrorism and other national security threats, which can be quite a dark thing to focus on. But as you said earlier, I mean, it's a human enterprise. At the end of the day, the national security community in the U.S., CIA, military, is all staffed by humans, many of whom have families, many of whom have, desires beyond what they're doing in the national security sector. And what I found being involved in what couldn't be a very dark mission was the camaraderie of my colleagues and the intimacy that I had with, all of those folks, both CIA and in the military and the State Department, on that humanity and a shared optimism towards, our own families and where we're going in the world. I mean, it sounds kind of perverse to a certain extent, but I served in Iraq 06 to 07. And it was a very tough time for the U.S. government. We were losing a lot of people. That was very sad and extremely stressful. Friends of mine being killed. But I look back at that as a formative year of my life, or a little over a year. And again, it sounds a bit perverse, but one of the happier times in my life. And it was because I was contributing to something meaningful with people that mattered to me. And despite the casualties, despite the death and destruction, and on the American side and on the Iraqi side, I still was able to maintain optimism and hope. And there's a lot of my colleagues, particularly in the military, who suffered a great deal of PTSD. I did not. I had a tough transition coming home, but I wouldn't argue it was PTSD, and that is a real thing. And so I feel blessed that I was able to keep my optimism when some of my friends were not. But even in the darkest times in my career, I found optimism, but it was because I had such supportive colleagues and friends. And even though we're retired, my peers were retired, we meet up for dinner and drinks like every other week, and share our pains and whatnot, but maintain that optimistic outlook because we do have people to lean on. And so for your listeners who've been in very stressful combat situations, or first responders like yourself in the paramedic world, you can't do it alone. Humans are not designed to go about the world and through crisis alone. I think having friends and family is the only way to maintain your optimism. So.
That's a beautiful note to end it on. Yeah. Andy Boyd, how can people connect with you?
I am online on LinkedIn. And there's several Andrew Boyds.
Sorry, did I say Lloyd?
No, Boyd.
Okay,
yeah. Andrew G. Boyd on LinkedIn. Hit me up on there, and I post most of my public engagements on there, and happy to communicate with everybody. And how about Andrew G. Boyd? Yeah.
How about Red Lattice and AE? I mixed up. I got Lloyd because I said Boyd and Red Lattice.
Yes.
I was preparing to mix them together.
Yes, and Red Lattice Paragon. For those of you who are interested, to learn more about what we do. Obviously, we have a website on Red Lattice. Paragon does as well, but you can get to the Paragon website in Israel via Red Lattice. And then AE Industrial Partners, the parent, the private equity entity that owns both, has a very active website on which I appear routinely. So AG Boyd on LinkedIn, Red Lattice Paragon, and AE Industrial Partners, all available out there.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.